Imagine sneezing your way through history, not just once, but for a lifetime, in an era when a runny nose meant everything from demonic possession to bad vibes caused by swamp air. No Benadryl, no tissues, no sympathy, just the sheer medieval joy of being told to sniff powdered toad bone, or rub goose fat on your chest while slowly choking on dust, hay and candle smoke. Welcome to the 1700s, a time when being allergic to life itself wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal, socially embarrassing, and often blamed on your imbalanced humors. Gesundheit? Not likely. Still breathing? Barely? Great. Hit that subscribe button before your sinuses swell shut, because nothing says soothing bedtime vibes like 18th century allergy suffering and the bizarre things people did to survive it. Springtime. The season of rebirth, renewal, and relentless respiratory sabotage. Birds chirp, flowers bloom, and your immune system declares open war on itself. Now imagine all that, but it's 1703, and you live in a rural hamlet, where the concept of allergy hasn't even been invented yet. Your nose is running like a terrified peasant. Your eyes are puffier than a powdered wig, and the local physician just blamed your sneezing on morally compromised air. Delightful. Back then, if you found yourself uncontrollably sniffling around flora, there wasn't a handy term like hay fever to comfort you. No tidy diagnosis. No Claritin commercials starring smiling women in meadows. Just the vague suggestion that perhaps your humors were misbehaving, or worse, that you were possessed. After all, in the 18th century, an itchy nose wasn't a medical issue, it was a cosmic one. Let's set the scene. Europe, mid-1700s. Enlightenment thinking is barely starting to peek over the horizon, but most folks are still thoroughly married to old-school beliefs. Think bleeding out demons, urine charts, and blaming illness on an ominous breeze from the east. The average person has never heard of the immune system, and why would they? Illness in general was less of a biological event and more of a divine mystery. If your body rebelled, clearly you had offended a saint, or your neighbor, or both. So when spring rolled around and the countryside erupted into a technicolor explosion of allergens, thousands of unlucky souls were suddenly sneezing, coughing, wheezing, and gasping, with no idea why. You couldn't Google "why does hay make my face leak?" You just tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Nobility would clutch their lace-trimmed kerchiefs and attempt to sneeze gracefully. Peasants, lacking handkerchiefs or grace, just sneezed openly into the void, or into a goat, depending on proximity. The term hay fever wouldn't even exist for another 100 years. And in the meantime, people came up with wildly creative explanations for what was making them so utterly miserable. One popular theory: bad air. Not metaphorical bad vibes, but literal miasma. The ancient belief that invisible, poisonous air wafted off swamps, garbage, or presumably your neighbor's armpit, carrying disease straight into your face. The idea had sticking power. For centuries, miasma theory guided everything from city planning to how close you were allowed to stand next to a particularly musty cheese wheel. And sneezing? That wasn't just a bodily reaction. It was a social event. In some circles, a hearty sneeze was seen as a sign of strong internal vitality, a robust spirit trying to expel whatever the opposite of vitality was. Elsewhere, though, it was met with suspicion, sudden bursts of uncontrolled air escaping your body. That could be demonic, or at the very least rude. Imagine trying to stifle a sneeze during a church sermon, in an era when everyone is already jumpy about witchcraft. One misplaced achoo and suddenly Sister Margaret is side-eyeing you like you just coughed up the devil himself. What made it worse was that allergies didn't discriminate. Peasant, merchant, noble, no one was safe. The pollen floated on the wind like an invisible assassin, coating every surface with its golden spite. Inside homes, ventilation was a myth, and windows were for rich people. That meant everything: beds, curtains. The one surviving family chicken was coated in layers of dust, dander, and pollen from the last 12 years. And outside? Farms were practically medieval torture devices for the immunologically challenged. Picture walking through a hayfield in 1750. The grass is waist-high. It's harvesting season. You're swinging a scythe with one hand and trying not to drown in your own mucus with the other. There's no such thing as a face mask, unless you count a kerchief soaked in vinegar. That's right, vinegar. Because in some folk circles, it was believed that sniffing vinegar-soaked rags could ward off the bad airs, All it actually did was give you one more reason to cry. And then there's the seasonal unpredictability. Some years a person might sneeze all spring. Other years, nothing. No one understood why. Was it the rain? The wind? The alignment of the moon? Your aunt's slightly cursed cabbage stew? You can bet someone blamed witches at some point. They always do. But perhaps the most tragic part of 18th century allergy suffering wasn't the lack of medicine. It was the complete and utter lack of acknowledgement. If you sneezed too much, people assumed you were sickly, or cursed, or just really dramatic. There was no supportive group chat to vent it, no TikTok to trend hay fever horrors. Just you, your leaky nose, and a society that thought you were weak for rubbing your eyes too much. And yet, some odd folks thrived in this pollen-packed environment. Local apothecaries, for example, made a killing selling remedies that were, at best, glorified herbs in a sack, at worst, live insects. Yes, more on that later. For now, let's pause and breathe it in, gently, if you can. The spring air, the smell of damp soil and blooming lilacs, the invisible army of pollen swirling up your nostrils like it owns the place. In a world with no antihistamines, no HEPA filters, and no concept of maybe we should dust the curtains, suffering was seasonal, spiritual, and entirely misunderstood. But here's the real question. The cliffhanger itching at your sinuses. What did they actually do when you couldn't stop sneezing? Because as much as people back then didn't understand allergies, they did love trying to fix things, usually in ways that would get you sued for malpractice today. By the 1700s, Europe was in the middle of an awkward identity crisis, a kind of philosophical puberty, where science and superstition existed in the same house, slept in the same bed, and glared at each other across the breakfast table. The Enlightenment had arrived, technically, but so had powdered wigs, bloodletting, and people who thought the moon affected their mucus production. Progress, as it turns out, is not linear. This was a world where you could walk into a physician's office, assuming you had the coin to pay for the privilege, and be treated with equal enthusiasm using a bleeding bowl and a telescope. Let's check your humours, madam, and also your star chart, because why choose between astrology and anatomy when you can be wrong in both directions? Allergy sufferers, not that anyone called them that yet, were especially vulnerable to this medical limbo. You'd stroll in with a nose like a tomato, eyes leaking like a broken dam, and the doctor would squint thoughtfully and proclaim, "Aha, you're suffering from an excess of phlegm." Groundbreaking. See, medicine still leaned heavily on the four-humor theory. You remember those guys. Blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Basically, your body was thought to be a medieval soup kitchen, and if one ingredient was out of balance, chaos ensued. Sneezing too much? That meant your cold and moist qualities were overwhelming your hot and dry ones. The solution? Make you less cold, less moist, somehow. And that's where things get truly horrifying. One possible treatment was cauterization, which is a fancy, medieval word for let's put hot metal near your face and see what happens. If your congestion refused to quit, someone might recommend placing a searing iron rod just above your upper lip. Why? To dry out the snot demons, obviously. And if that didn't work, they'd consider inserting hot coals wrapped in muslin near your nostrils. You know, for balance. Then there were the leeches. Of course there were leeches. If you had a runny nose, a weak pulse, or just seemed mildly annoying, someone somewhere was ready to slap a wriggling parasite on your neck and call it medicine. A popular site for allergy leeching, the temples. That's right. Nothing screams cutting-edge treatment like letting a bloodsucker latch onto your forehead because you keep sneezing at dinner. But that wasn't all. Let's not forget mustard plasters, the miracle sludge of the 18th century. These charming poultices were made by grinding mustard seeds into a burning paste and applying them to your chest, hoping the overwhelming sensation would somehow distract your body into stopping the sneeze. It was less healing and more torture that smelled like deli condiments. And then came the real kicker. Planetary diagnosis. Let that sink in. People diagnosed congestion using the stars. It wasn't enough to bleed you, roast you, or smother you in mustard paste. The doctor would also want to know your birthday so he could consult his astrological almanac. Mars in retrograde. That might explain the wheezing. Venus opposing Saturn. Clearly why your sinuses feel like they've been stuffed with damp parchment. Mercury in a bad mood? Time to balance your bile, baby. This was considered normal. So yes, in this grand collision of medieval medicine and rising rationalism, the allergy sufferer became a kind of unwilling test subject in the world's least relaxing spa, the soothing scent of chamomile. Sure, if chamomile hadn't just been boiled with fox bile and smeared on your feet, the relaxing bath, only if it contained 3 cups of vinegar, a rotten apple, and a Latin prayer. But in all fairness, not everyone in the medical community was clueless. Some early Enlightenment thinkers were beginning to question the madness. They started noticing patterns, seasonal symptoms, shared triggers, localized reactions. They didn't call it allergy, but they were inching closer to the idea that maybe, just maybe, the body wasn't a spiritual battlefield, but a flawed but fascinating machine. Unfortunately, they were often shouted down by tradition-loving colleagues still drawing charts about the bodily effects of the moon on your nasal cavities. One camp was saying, maybe there's a natural explanation for this, and the other camp was yelling, Mars demands we apply goose fat to the armpits. Guess who won that argument? Hint, it wasn't science, and that left sufferers stuck in the middle, bleeding from the nose, dripping from the eyes, and wondering how they could simultaneously be too cold, too moist, too spiritual, and too cursed. To make it worse, treatments often varied by region. In Italy, they might prescribe garlic steam. In Germany, hot beer with chamomile and a touch of salt. In England, well, England mostly believed in perseverance, prayer, and probably whiskey. Doctors there recommended tonics made of things like wood ash, rabbit fat, or in one memorable case, scraped lichen from a north-facing tombstone. Because obviously nothing says anti-inflammatory like fungus from the dead side of a churchyard. So what did this all feel like for the common allergy sufferer? Imagine this. You wake up in a straw-stuffed mattress, your eyes crusted shut, your throat dry, your nose swollen. You walk outside into the morning light, greeted not by fresh air, but a hay cart being whipped into a golden cloud of pollen. You sneeze, again, and again. You stumble into the local apothecary, who peers at your blotchy face and prescribes a tincture made from burnt hedgehog, salt, and something unpronounceable. You thank him, pay in turnips, and leave with a jar of hope and disappointment. And here's the worst part. You believed it. Because what choice did you have? That's the tragedy of it. These people weren't stupid. They were just stuck with the best bad ideas available. And when your only options were fire, blood, vinegar, or the opinion of Jupiter, you learned to endure. Now, the next time your nose starts to tingle, remember, you could have been born in 1702, holding a leech to your temple while someone read your horoscope and sprinkled pepper on your chest. And yet, this was just the beginning. Because if your sneezing didn't go away, people started asking different questions. Like, who exactly gave you that curse in the first place? Let's take a little stroll, not through the halls of medicine this time, but through the cobbled streets of superstition, where logic checks out early and suspicion wears a bonnet. You've got a sneeze. A wet, uncontrollable, repetitive sneeze. But instead of being handed a tissue, you're handed a side eye, a whispered prayer, and if you're really lucky, a good old-fashioned accusation of witchcraft. Welcome to rural Europe in the 1700s, where your runny nose might just get someone burned at the stake. You see, for many villagers far from the centers of Enlightenment thought, illness wasn't a matter of biology. It was moral, cosmic, the result of sin, curses, or that strange woman who looked at your cows funny last week. Medicine? That was for the rich, or the suspiciously educated. For everyone else, sneezing too much was a sign that someone, maybe even you, had angered forces better left alone. And so began the sneeze-driven witch hunts. It wasn't always so dramatic, of course. Sometimes it was just muttering, a passing comment about how your daughter hasn't stopped coughing since old widow Gerda walked by her cradle, or how the goats have been twitchy ever since the apothecary's apprentice started rubbing herbs on her wrists. The correlation didn't need to make sense. It just needed to be vaguely spooky. Take the story of Lisbeth from Saxony, a real tale tucked into obscure legal records from the early 1700s. Her neighbour began sneezing violently one spring, daily fits, no sleep, nose redder than a cardinal in heat. Naturally, the town decided Lisbeth had bewitched him with a sneeze curse, as one does. She was dragged before the magistrate and told to confess or face further persuasion, which is a dainty euphemism for torture, until you admit to cursing someone with your vibes. Lisbeth was lucky. If you call exile luck, she was driven out of the village, barefoot, through the mud. sneezing herself by that point, because irony is cruel. She never returned. The neighbor, by the way, kept sneezing. Turns out he was working in a hayloft. All day. Every day. But it was easier to blame the old woman than the literal piles of allergens stuffed under the roof. It wasn't just Germany. In small English villages, sneezing fits were seen as signs of air poisoning, which was bad, but manageable. Unless, of course, the fits coincided with the death of a chicken, or a sour milk incident. Then things escalated quickly. That's when people started talking about maleficium, malevolent magic, the kind that curdled cream, withered crops, and apparently gave people congestion. And what did this look like in practice? Imagine this. You're at the local well, drawing water. You sneeze 3 times in a row. The woman next to you edges away. She tells someone. By sundown, you've got people crossing themselves in your direction and muttering about how ever since she moved here, the barley's gone strange. A week later, someone's drawn a cross in ash on your door, and that's a good outcome. Because, in some places, it got worse. In the Basque region, tales abound of shepherds who began to suffer mysterious nosebleeds during lambing season. The community, rather than consider maybe, just maybe, that hay, dust and close proximity to livestock might be the cause, blamed the village midwife who had once declined to bless a sheep. She was tied to a tree, forced to confess under threat of drowning, and then run out of town, while everyone else congratulated themselves for restoring balance. Let that image settle for a moment. Someone's immune system reacts to allergens, and the community solution is to exile the herbalist who refused to say a blessing over livestock. And here's the kicker. The people who did this weren't monsters. They were scared. They were uninformed. They were trying to make sense of suffering in a world that didn't give them answers. Only rituals. The idea that something invisible could cause this much misery, that your own body might betray you because it was confused. That was too strange. Better to blame it on curses. Curses made sense. Curses had rules. Someone did something wrong, and now you're sneezing. Cause and effect. Order, restore. Of course, these suspicions didn't just target others. Sometimes, the sneezer was blamed for their own affliction. You must have opened your soul to wickedness, a priest might say. Repent, and the sneezing will stop, which is a lovely sentiment right up until you're kneeling in a cold church, eyes streaming, while someone chants over you in Latin and tries to banish the spirits from your nasal cavity. Even children weren't safe. One unfortunate record from northern France recounts a boy who sneezed so often during Mass that he was suspected of harboring a demon in his lungs. A demon in his lungs. The solution: 3 days of fasting, a goat sacrifice, because sure, why not, and an overnight vigil under holy icons. He survived. So did the demon, most likely named ragweed. And then there were the folk remedies. Oh, the folk remedies. If someone was cursed, you had to draw out the evil. That might mean burying an onion under your threshold, or burning a lock of hair, or my personal favorite, placing a live frog on your throat, and waiting for it to absorb the sin. Don't worry, the frog was usually released afterward, assuming it didn't sneeze too. All of this leads to one inescapable truth. Being allergic in the 1700s didn't just suck, it was dangerous. Not because of the sneezing itself though, make no mistake, it was miserable, but because of what that sneezing meant to people who didn't know any better. To them, it was never just a sneeze. It was a symptom of something darker, something you couldn't see, something someone had done. And if you couldn't stop sneezing, well then you must have been cursed or cursed someone. But here's the real nightmare. What if you lived in a city? More people, more superstitions, more smoke, more allergens. Surely things were better in a city, right? Wrong. Welcome to the urban allergy gauntlet. Let's take a deep breath and step into a European city in the 1700s. Wait, actually, don't take that deep breath. You'll regret it. Because the air, it's a delicate cocktail of coal smoke, rotting vegetable matter, horse droppings, and a little something I like to call 18th century mystery dust. It's in your nose, your mouth, your soul. The city is alive, and it wants to give you an upper respiratory infection. For the allergy-prone, cities weren't safer than the countryside. They were concentrated, high-efficiency torture chambers. If rural life meant exposure to pollen and hay, urban life introduced you to a whole new genre of histamine hell. Dirt roads churned up clouds of dust with every passing carriage. Street sweepers, where they existed, mostly just pushed the filth from one pile to another. And chimney smoke, that was basically background noise. Every home, bakery, tannery, and smithy puffing away like they were competing in some kind of soot-based Olympics. You didn't walk through a city, you waded through it. Now picture being allergic to dust, or smoke, or animal dander. Congratulations, you've just won the worst vacation package in history. There were no air filters, no dust masks, no this train is pet-free zone. You shared your world with dogs, cats, rats, goats, open fires, and the occasional surprise chicken. Every shop had a resident animal. Every tavern reeked of sweat and mildew, and every window was shut tight against night air, which according to popular belief could kill you dead. Fresh air, suspicious. Damp mold-infused closet air, medicinal. Let that logic simmer for a moment. And just when you thought things couldn't get more sneeze-inducing, let's talk bedding. Urban residents, rich and poor alike, slept on piles of organic material, feathers, straw, horsehair, sometimes moss, and these beds were never, ever cleaned. They weren't washed. They were aired out, which meant being left in a dusty courtyard for the same sun that made the chamber pots stink. You're lying on this glorious concoction, breathing shallowly, trying not to move too much, lest you disturb the ecosystem of mites and particles living beneath you. Restful. Now imagine waking up in that bed. Your nose is already running. Your eyes bloodshot. You stumble toward the window for relief, and are immediately assaulted by chimney smoke from the bakery next door. The baker, incidentally, is tossing flour in the air like it's confetti. No one told him about airborne particles. Your lungs begin to close. Happy Wednesday. Public spaces didn't offer much escape, either. Churches were cavernous dust traps. Taverns were humid, body-filled sneeze bunkers. And the theatre? Ah yes, the theatre. The place where culture went to cough. Enter the theatre cough. A real and common phenomenon in which entire audiences would wheeze in solidarity as dust floated down from the rafters and into their powdered nostrils. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with the city's finest sneezers, trying to enjoy a performance while praying your lungs didn't stage their own dramatic exit. And just to sprinkle some extra irony on top, cleanliness, such as it existed, often made things worse. Street cleaning involved throwing water onto the roads to tamp down dust, which only created soggy filth that dried into a perfect crust for future allergens. Public laundries were rare, so clothes were seldom washed, and usually just beaten with sticks until the dust gave up. Furniture was dusted by slapping it with a rag, sending a lovely cloud of allergens into the air like a bouquet of invisible needles. The poor, of course, had it worst. Tenement buildings were overcrowded and damp, with walls that seemed to sweat mildew. Entire families might live in a single windowless room filled with straw beds, smoke from a central hearth, and the occasional surprise rat, all of which were excellent triggers for a spontaneous sneezing fit. And if you thought you could step outside for fresh air, good luck. The neighbor was boiling tripe again, the tannery's releasing something sulfuric, and someone's emptied their chamber pot onto the street. Breathe deeply, if you dare. But it wasn't all grim. Sometimes, sneezing served a social function, a handy excuse to step outside and pretend you weren't about to pass out from the odor of pickled herring and body heat. And in some social circles, a delicate sneeze was considered cute. Women were encouraged to keep scented handkerchiefs for modest sniffling. If you could sneeze without turning red, you might even be seen as refined. Of course, if you had hay fever and sneezed like a cannon going off, you were just seen as uncouth. Even the aristocracy, despite living in larger, better ventilated homes, weren't immune. In fact, they had more carpets, more drapes, more perfumed candles, and more things to set your nose on fire. Parlor rooms were dense with fabric, smoke, powder, and the delicate reek of centuries of not knowing what airflow meant. It was like sneezing inside a very judgmental pillow. And don't think doctors in the city had better answers. They were just as baffled as their rural counterparts, but with fancier waistcoats. They'd still tell you to apply leeches, or balance your humours, or take a trip to the countryside, where, ironically, the pollen count was even worse. If that failed, you could always try snuff, the powdered tobacco that people literally inhaled on purpose. It cleared your sinuses, sure, mostly because it burned the lining right off. So yes, urban life in the 1700s was a non-stop obstacle course of airborne misery, where every breath was a gamble and every sneeze was a minor crisis. People lived shoulder to shoulder in a swirling fog of filth, without even the courtesy of understanding why their faces were constantly betraying them. Ever been in a dusty attic? Multiply that by life. And if that doesn't sound like fun, just wait until we get to the solutions, because in the next chapter we're exploring what doctors actually did to you when your sneezing refused to cooperate. Spoiler, onions were involved. So were your eyeballs. Yes. Really. You're wheezing. Your sinuses feel like they've been stuffed with horsehair and sealed shut. Your eyes won't stop leaking. Naturally, you do what anyone would do in the 1700s. You drag yourself to the local physician's house, hoping for wisdom, relief, or at least someone who won't accuse you of being hexed. Congratulations, you've just enrolled in the unofficial medical roulette of early modern Europe. No copay required, just a strong stomach and very low expectations. So, what happens next? Well, the doctor greets you in a powdered wig that's probably older than your shoes. He peers at your inflamed face and immediately nods, as if your suffering confirms something profound. Ah yes, he says, with confidence entirely unearned. The vapors are attacking your humors. Then he turns and rummages through a wooden cabinet of horrors that contains things like dried mouse tails, deer antler dust, and some vaguely sticky bottles with Latin labels and unknown expiration dates. And that's when he pulls out the raw onion. See, in the grand tradition of doing things that seem medically questionable, the raw onion was a popular panacea, especially for catarrh, a delightful old-timey word that basically means your entire face is leaking, and no one knows why. Onions were thought to draw out illness, thanks to their sharp smell, ability to make you cry, and vague resemblance to a shriveled skull. In some cases, the onion was sliced and applied to the feet. Logical? No. Traditional? Very. But in the more aggressive protocols, that pungent orb of misery was rubbed directly on the eyes, or worse, placed beneath the eyelids. That's right. Imagine someone gently prying your eyelid open and slipping in a juicy wedge of raw onion, all in the name of reducing congestion. Side effects may include sobbing, screaming, blindness, and losing faith in humanity. But onions were only the beginning. Doctors, and we're using that term generously, had an entire toolkit of remedies that ranged from laughable to lawsuit-worthy. For instance, if your nasal passages were blocked, they might recommend snorting hot vinegar, not drinking it, snorting it, because what could be more soothing for inflamed sinuses than a shot of acetic acid straight to the brain? Then there were mustard plasters. Again, always with the mustard plasters. Applied to the chest, they were meant to draw out the sickness via heat and irritation. In reality, they gave you a second-degree burn and a new reason to cry. Add a touch of horseradish or cayenne pepper to really spice things up. This wasn't healthcare. It was a condiment-based hazing ritual. If that didn't work, the physician might recommend you smoke. Yes, smoke. Tobacco, opium, or whatever was lying around. Smoking, you see, was thought to dry out the lungs, as if your respiratory tract was a damp cellar that needed airing. Some particularly cruel treatments even involved blowing smoke through the nostrils using a special pipe, or in more theatrical cases, up the other end. And yes, I do mean that end. The 18th century really was the golden age of, are you sure this is helping? Now, suppose the doctor decided you needed to sweat it out. Enter the sweating regimen, in which you'd be bundled in heavy blankets beside a roaring fire while sipping hot broth infused with herbs, wine, and maybe some crushed beetle for flavor. The goal to produce copious sweat and allegedly evict the illness from your pores like an unwanted roommate. The actual result: dehydration, hallucinations, and if you were lucky, temporary relief from sneezing because you'd be too weak to lift your head. But wait, there's more. For particularly stubborn cases of allergic misery, physicians might reach for more exotic tools. Ever tried powdered toad bone? Neither have I, but some people swore by it. You'd crush the dried remains of a toad into a fine dust, sprinkle it into a warm drink, and hope for the best. And if you vomited, even better, that meant the illness was leaving the body, or your soul was. Hard to tell. Other favoured ingredients included dried snakeskin, roasted badger fat, ambergris, yes, the whale vomit, and even mummy dust. Real mummy dust. Ground up remains of ancient Egyptians were believed to have mystical healing properties, particularly if consumed with wine. So yes, if you were sneezing uncontrollably in 1722, someone might suggest you sip Cabernet and powdered Faro. This was considered reasonable. Let that sink in. You're sneezing, and someone hands you a chalice of fermented grape juice and corpse. The unifying theory behind all these treatments: onions in the eyes, vinegar in the nose, smoke in the lungs, dead things in the tea, was simple. The illness had to be purged, flushed out, expelled. Your body was a leaking bag of elements, and the physician's job was to plug some holes, burn others, and pray the entire system didn't collapse. And if none of it worked, well, that wasn't the doctor's fault. It was your constitution. Or maybe you were cursed. Or maybe God was just feeling spicy that week. What makes all this worse, somehow, is that people actually paid for it. Sometimes in money, sometimes in chickens, always in dignity. You'd leave the physician's house reeking of vinegar, blinking through onion tears, with a pouch of powdered snake dandruff in your hand, and a prayer to Saint Sneezefree on your lips. Desperation does strange things to people. At what point do you just let the sneezing win? That question must have haunted countless people. How many poor souls just gave up, accepted that springtime meant 3 months of facial misery? That walking past a stable might turn them into a blubbering mess for the rest of the day? That their only hope of peace was to marry someone who didn't mind a partner who cried constantly and smelled faintly of cabbage poultices? Of course, for the wealthy there were options: private physicians, imported remedies, and at least a room or two with windows. But for most people, especially those living in crowded homes or dusty hovels, there was no escape. No spa retreats, no allergy-safe diets, just hope, prayer, and the occasional experimental eyeball onion. Still, we shouldn't laugh too hard. They didn't know better. And frankly, if you'd spent your entire life thinking bad air and bile were the main enemies of health, you'd probably try rubbing a frog on your face too. But for one man, a peasant with the worst possible career choice, the battle with allergies was personal. Brutally, intimately personal. Because next we're spending a day in the life of someone who's allergic to hay and works with hay. His name is Jacob. He's 32, though he looks 48. The kind of weathered face that tells you he's spent most of his life squinting into sunlight, chewing dry bread, and wondering whether this is the year the crops turn on him. Jacob is a peasant farmer somewhere in Lower Saxony in the year 1741. And today, like every day, he is preparing to suffer, not from plague, famine, or war, although those are always options, but from something crueler, more personal. Jacob is violently allergic to hay, and yet his entire life revolves around it. Jacob wakes just before sunrise in a cottage that could generously be described as structurally experimental. The thatched roof is leaking again. The bed is straw, the pillow is straw, and the blanket is something that used to be wool, but is now mostly mites and regret. He sneezes before he even opens his eyes. 3 times. Loudly. The dog stirs. The chickens stare. His wife, Marta, is already up. She's boiling something questionable in a pot that may contain oats, turnip, or yesterday's boot. She hands him a ladleful with the tenderness of someone who's accepted that love sometimes looks like congealed beige. He drinks it. He sneezes again. She sighs. Jacob's job today, like every day, is hay. Feeding the livestock, repairing the roof, bedding the ox, hauling bales, living in a never-ending blizzard of dried grass particles. The thing that makes his eyes water and throat itch is also the thing keeping them alive. There is unfortunately no medieval equivalent of working remotely. Outside, the air is crisp, sharp, with the scent of manure and frost. Jacob grabs his pitchfork and heads to the barn. Every step kicks up dust. The moment he opens the doors, a golden fog of hay and irritation hits him in the face like a sack of betrayal. He sneezes so hard his hat flies off. Again, the cow looks unimpressed. The morning is slow agony. Jacob spreads hay across the stall floors, each motion stirring up clouds that infiltrate every pore. He tries to breathe through his mouth, which just makes him cough. He tries holding his breath, which works for 8 seconds. Eventually, he surrenders to the rhythm. Lift, spread, sneeze. Lift, spread, sneeze. His eyes are streaming. His face is crimson. His dignity has left the building. At one point, his neighbor Otto stops by. Otto is hearty, burly. He eats gravel for breakfast, and probably thinks allergens are a French myth. He watches Jacob sneezing uncontrollably, and offers the kind of rural wisdom only centuries of unlicensed folk medicine can provide. Have you tried stuffing lavender up your nose? Otto asks, chewing a twig. Jacob nods. Yes. And nettles, and cold onion broth. Otto shrugs. Might be your soul trying to escape. Jacob thanks him and sneezes in his direction. By noon the sun is high, and Jacob can't see it through the blur in his eyes. He wipes his face with a rag that is less fabric and more sentimental dust. Marta brings him a meal, cold turnip paste and stale bread, with a side of sympathy. She's wrapped it in leaves to keep it fresh. He's allergic to the leaves. As he eats, leaning against a bale of hay like a man awaiting execution, Jacob stares into the field and wonders what it would be like to have a job that doesn't involve slow biological warfare, something like cobbling, or rat catching, or being professionally dead. But his mind always circles back. There's no escape. He can't change trades, peasants don't pivot. He can't move. Land is tied to families, debts, obligations, and he can't stop working, not unless he wants to watch his children starve next winter. So he sneezes again, harder this time. Blood appears. Great. That afternoon, the sun bakes the hay, releasing more particles into the air. Jacob climbs to the loft to toss bales down to the feeding trough. The ladder wobbles. His head pounds. At one point, he loses his balance mid-sneeze and nearly falls. He chuckles bitterly. Imagine dying that way. Allergic, congested, crushed by the very thing trying to kill you. By sundown, he's dragging himself back inside. His skin is raw, his nostrils burned. His throat feels like he gargled with gravel and bees. He tries to wash off the worst of it, but the water is cold, and the soap is a slimy lump of ash and animal fat. He smells like hay, sweat, smoke, and faint desperation. Jacob sits at the hearth. His children are drawing on the dirt floor with sticks. He can't smell the stew cooking. His nose no longer functions. Marta asks how he feels. He says, "Fine." He always says fine. What else is there to say? As night settles in, the family crawls into bed together. The straw mattress sighs beneath their weight, releasing another puff of microscopic rage into the air. Jacob sneezes again. His wife hands him a cloth. He folds it into a triangle and presses it to his face. He doesn't bother hoping it'll stop. It won't. And tomorrow, he'll do it all again. You've never rooted for someone to find a clean handkerchief so badly. You want him to rest, to breathe, to lie in a bed that doesn't itch and wake up without bleeding from the nose. But he won't, because this is life, real, historical life. No dramatic rescue, no epiphany, just hay, always hay. Jacob is one of thousands, tens of thousands, who sneezed their way through history without fanfare. There are no statues of the chronically congested, no songs about the man with the unstoppable post-nasal drip, just quiet, invisible suffering, the kind that doesn't make it into textbooks because it doesn't kill dramatically enough. But while Jacob toils, wheezing and wiping and pretending it's normal, high society has its own problems. Different smells, different poisons, different kinds of allergic misery. Because next up, we're entering a world of perfume powder and powdered wigs. If Jacob the hay fever peasant was locked in a never-ending slap fight with rural allergens, his aristocratic counterparts were caught in a fragrant, powdery hurricane of their own making. Because while nobility didn't roll around in hay, they invented entirely new ways to assault their immune systems, all in the name of fashion, hygiene, and not smelling like the street. Let's begin in the boudoir, that grand perfume chamber of pre-breakfast suffering. A noblewoman rises at 10, because of course she does, and the air is already thick with lavender, rose oil, and the ghost of last night's candle smoke. Her bed canopy hasn't been washed in decades, because it's brocade and special, and her feather mattress is practically an allergen farm. First, the morning toilet. This is not a bathroom break. This is a ritual. It involves layers of pomades, hair powders, and cosmetics made from lead, mercury, and crushed pearls. Her maid puffed scented powder into her wig, generously, until her hair resembles a wedding cake, suffering from seasonal depression. This powder is not hypoallergenic. It's flour. Sometimes it's starch. Sometimes it's literal powdered bone. All of it is floating in the air, clinging to curtains, and lodging itself in the deepest recesses of the sinus cavity. By the time she's dressed, she has inhaled enough particulate matter to sand a canoe. Her nose itches. Her eyes are pink. But no one says a word, because sneezing is just part of the experience, like corsets, or boredom. Across the city, a nobleman prepares for court. He douses himself in cologne, a blend of alcohol, herbs, and whale vomit. That's not a joke. Ambergris, a prized perfume ingredient, was harvested from the intestines of whales and sold at a premium. Its scent was described as musky, sweet, and not technically lethal. Combine that with powdered wig dust and pipe smoke, and you've got a cocktail of allergens that could flatten a lesser man. And yet, these people powered through. Because court wasn't just about appearances, it was only about appearances. To sneeze too much, to break out in a rash, to rub your eyes in public, it was undignified, weak, and so, aristocrats trained themselves to suffer gracefully. Women developed a delicate, polite sneeze, a little chew hidden behind a lace fan. Men coughed into snuff boxes like they were suppressing world-changing ideas. Still, the suffering was real. Letters from the period are littered with complaints. The Countess of Mayfair has taken ill with a severe dripping of the eyes. Lord Pemberley finds himself most afflicted when visiting the conservatory. The Duchess has been confined to her room, suffering from violent coughs and delicate humours. Delicate humours. Translation: she walked through the perfume wing of the palace, and now can't stop crying. Ironically, much of the upper class's allergic torment was self-inflicted. They designed homes to trap smells, heavy curtains, thick carpets, upholstered walls. They refused to open windows for fear of miasma. They stored furs, feathers, and herbs in abundance. Their very lives were curated allergen exhibitions. And then there were the salons, those gossip-fueled rooms of candlelight, powdered conversation, and airborne misery. Imagine 20 people in a velvet-lined room, each wearing scented wigs and wool garments, puffing snuff, sipping wine, and laughing through tight-laced corsets. Now imagine that one of them sneezes, just once. Suddenly the room tenses. Was it the tobacco? The lilies on the table? The Count's cologne, which smells like citrus and regret? But here's the twist. Some women wanted to faint. Swooning was fashionable. It showed delicacy, femininity, a touch of mystery. So they leaned into it, overwhelmed by perfume. Perfect time to collapse artfully onto a chaise, watery eyes from the floral arrangements. A dramatic exit is simply good manners. If you sneezed too hard, you could blame your sensitive constitution and be applauded for it. There were even specific smelling salts for reviving, basically a pretext to inhale something that didn't smell like feet and whale. And what about the theatre? Ah yes, the glittering jewel of high society. You dress in layers of velvet and brocade, cover your face with powder, perfume your gloves, and then squeeze into a seat beside hundreds of others doing the same. The lights dim, the curtain rises, and halfway through the second act, the man behind you starts coughing. Not a polite cough, a sustained, hacking, phlegmy event. You clutch your scented kerchief, and pray to the powdered gods of Versailles that he doesn't have the galloping consumption, or worse, cat dander. By midnight, a noblewoman returns to her room, utterly exhausted from the effort of looking graceful while slowly asphyxiating. Her skin is red. Her throat is sore. Her sinuses are waging a civil war. She collapses into bed, surrounded by her scented pillows and soft candle smoke, and prays for a sneeze-free morning. She will not get it. Because her allergy isn't to one thing, it's to everything. The powder, the perfume, the feathers, the mold on the wine cellar walls, the starch in her underthings, the rat droppings in the rafters, the snuff in her snuff box, the lead in her makeup, the candle wax, the firewood, the mildew in the lace. And what if she's allergic to herself? What if your body reacts violently to the things society tells you to wear, to smell like, to be? That wasn't a question they asked out loud. Because if you sneezed too much, you simply weren't delicate. If your skin broke out in hives, you clearly lacked refinement. If your lungs rebelled, perhaps you were meant for simpler surroundings. So you learned to suffer in silence, to sneeze in secret, to sniff discreetly, to powder over the red blotches, and paint a face that said, "I am thriving," even when your lymph nodes were crying. Because in the 1700s, allergies weren't conditions, they were inconveniences, embarrassments, weaknesses to be hidden under silk and scented powder. But while the nobility sniffled into lace and called it elegance, a new battleground for allergies was brewing, one far less refined and far more crawling. Next stop, the domestic chaos of pets, plagues, and things that made you itch. If you thought pollen was your worst enemy in the 1700s, let me introduce you to your real roommates, the itchy, furry, dander-shedding, flea-ridden disasters politely referred to as domestic animals. Pets, livestock, rodents, and all their delightful microscopic byproducts were just part of daily life. There were no hypoallergenic breeds, no monthly flea medication, and certainly no one vacuuming the couch. In fact, no one even had a couch, just scratchy wooden benches covered in whatever rags hadn't been turned into diapers. Let's start with cats. Loved by some, loathed by others, and often suspected of moonlighting as witches. Cats roamed homes freely, killing mice, knocking over oil lamps, and shedding fur in every crevice of your already filthy bedding. Allergic to cats? Too bad. They were considered necessary members of the household ecosystem. You'd wheeze in silence because the alternative was plague-bearing rats. Literally. Dogs weren't much better. The family dog wasn't some clean, brushed showpiece. It was usually half feral, occasionally bathed in river water, and full of charming parasites. Dogs tracked in mud, mold, and more than a few decaying animal bits they found in the woods. They slept indoors during cold weather, curled up beside their owners, shedding hair, spreading dander, and occasionally introducing fleas into the marital bed. Romantic. Now, rodents. No one wanted them, but everyone had them. Mice and rats lived in the walls, scurried across beams, and nested under beds. Their fur, their droppings, and their dander filled the air with invisible allergens. And when they died, which they frequently did, they rotted in place, releasing an aroma that, astonishingly, no one associated with lung irritation. If you sneezed too much in winter, it might have been the cold, or it might have been the mummified mouse inside the chimney flue. Who's to say? But the real MVP of allergic misery? Livestock. Many homes, especially in poorer rural areas, housed animals inside the home. Chickens clucked around the hearth. Goats dozed in corners. Pigs rooted under tables. These animals were sources of warmth, food, and constant biological assault. Imagine eating breakfast next to a molting hen, while the goat chews on your boot. You love them. You also suspect they're slowly killing you. Welcome to the paradox of 18th century animal companionship. And of course, no home was complete without lice. Hair lice, body lice, blanket lice. Lice were practically family members. They didn't trigger your immune system the way dander did, but their presence made you scratch constantly, and scratching led to irritation, broken skin, and open wounds, which then got infected, which then made you sneeze, because life is a rich tapestry of interconnected misery. As for hygiene, the concept of cleaning your home was relative. Floors were swept with brooms, made from dried reeds, which mostly just pushed the dirt into new corners. Furniture was dusted occasionally, but without vacuums or microfiber cloths. This often meant slapping it with a dry rag and celebrating as a cloud of particles launched into the air like it had something to prove. Linens were seldom washed. Washing was laborious, expensive, and involved either rivers or buckets and soap that smelled like boiled hooves, so people reused their sheets, pillowcases, and clothing for weeks, sometimes months. The longer you waited, the more likely your bedding was to become a charming blend of dust, sweat, skin flakes, and invisible mite parties. And guess what mites are? Allergens with legs. Let's not forget mold. Mold lived in the corners of every house. It bloomed on walls. It bloomed on bread. It bloomed on your future. Stone walls absorbed moisture like a sponge, and poor insulation meant condensation collected wherever breath and cold air collided. People didn't call it mold, of course. They called it damp, which sounds quaint until you realize it's the reason half the population had chronic coughs. Now picture this. You're a young servant working in the home of a noble family. You sleep in the attic with 3 others on a pile of old quilts. There are rats in the rafters. The cat won't stop sneezing. The maid has eczema, but everyone thinks it's spiritual unrest. You wake up every morning with a face full of dust, eyes like ripe tomatoes, and a nose that leaks like a cursed fountain. You mention it to the cook. She hands you a clove of garlic and tells you to wear it around your neck. You do. It doesn't help. The goat still sheds. The dog still sleeps on your legs. You try praying, but your sneezing drowns out the Lord's Prayer. Now imagine that this is your life, forever. No breaks, no vacations, no visits to an allergist, because they haven't been invented yet. No antihistamines, no clean air filters, just you and the slow, gritty erosion of your lungs by tiny particles that no one believes exist. Ever vacuumed your couch cushions? Yeah, imagine never doing that, ever. In fact, imagine living your whole life on top of your couch cushions, inside them, beneath them, while animals sleep on you, while mold kisses your cheeks, while rats nibble at your personal boundaries, and no one even knows what the word allergy means. You're just sickly, or sensitive, or being punished for some unknown cosmic offense. But then, something strange begins to happen. A few curious minds, doctors, scientists, thinkers with too much time and too many notes, start noticing patterns. A new idea begins to take root. Something scientific. Could it be that all this sneezing is more than just bad luck? It begins not with a sneeze, but with a sigh, the weary exhale of an 18th century physician who's finally had enough of leeches, astrology, and powdered frogs. The enlightenment, that glittering age of reason and powdered foreheads, is underway. Telescopes are pointed at the stars, microscopes are aimed at pond water, and somewhere, tucked between scientific revolutions and an appalling lack of deodorant, someone starts to wonder, why is everyone still sneezing? Enter John Bostock. In the early 1800s. Okay, technically cheating a little on our century boundary, but let's roll with it. Bostock becomes the first man to formally document what we now know as hay fever. He calls it catarrhus estivus, which is Latin for "this sucks," and it happens every summer. Bostock was both a physician and a hay fever sufferer himself, which probably gave his medical observations a slightly saltier edge. After all, nothing sharpens scientific curiosity quite like being personally betrayed by your own nose. But long before Bostock's diagnosis hit the ink, the intellectual gears had already begun to turn. Enlightenment thinkers were increasingly skeptical of supernatural explanations for disease. They started measuring things, temperatures, pressures, pulses, and dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, invisible forces like bad air could be replaced by even more invisible forces like pollen. Progress. Still, the old beliefs didn't go quietly. Plenty of physicians continued to straddle both worlds. One minute, they were measuring your breathing rate. The next, they were recommending foxglove tea and prayer. Some still blamed planetary misalignment. Others just blamed your mother's temperament. Nervous constitutions, they said, were particularly prone to summertime ailments. Meaning, if you were a woman, they assumed you were weak. If you were a man, they assumed you drank too much wine. And, if you were a child, well, children were supposed to be sickly. That was their entire brand. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine being the first person told your sneezing isn't evil, just inconvenient. You're sitting in a candlelit examination room. The doctor doesn't mention ghosts, doesn't recommend bloodletting, and doesn't try to rub pickled onions on your face. Instead, he calmly tells you that your body is reacting to an external irritant. You blink, you sniff, you sneeze again. But this time, no one flinches. No one calls a priest. They just hand you a linen cloth and nod. Revolutionary. Of course, this new thinking didn't exactly lead to effective treatments, but it did lead to meticulous documentation. Physicians began keeping case notes, recording symptoms, creating little sneeze diaries, if you will. Patient reports nasal irritation following exposure to flowering grasses. Subject experiences respiratory distress during dry seasons. It wasn't medicine yet, but it was observation. The first step in any good scientific misadventure. Meanwhile, the rest of society looked on with polite confusion. After all, if a gentleman suffered violently during the summer months, wasn't it more romantic to assume he had a poetic soul? The idea of allergies was still far too clinical. Too boring. A man sniffling in the garden. Clearly he was mourning something. A lady fainting during a picnic? Undoubtedly the heat or delicate feelings, not ragweed. Still, the idea of seasonal affliction began to catch on. Some doctors proposed that hay, actual hay, released invisible particles that attack the sensitive. Others thought it might be the sun, or the dryness, or even magnetic fluctuations in the Earth's crust. Spoiler, none of these people had microscopes powerful enough to see a pollen grain, but they were trying. They were groping toward truth in a fog of flower dust. And sometimes that fog was literal. As industrialization crept forward, cities began experimenting with green spaces. Small parks, tree-lined avenues, botanical gardens, places for fresh air, health, leisure, and also unregulated, unmeasured, ungodly amounts of blooming plant life. People would stroll through these leafy corridors and immediately burst into tears. Their lungs closed, their eyes swelled, and suddenly the question wasn't, "Are you cursed?" It was, "Did you pass by the azaleas again?" Even literature picked up on it. Poets wrote about spring, not just as a time of beauty, but of melancholy, of illness, of longing. Allergy sufferers had unwittingly influenced the arts. Their suffering became metaphor. Their wheezing, a tragic soundtrack to the awakening world. And yet, the treatments remained ridiculous. Despite mounting evidence that the symptoms were caused by airborne irritants, physicians continued to offer solutions that involved more suffering. You could try oil of eucalyptus, if you could afford it, or a cold compress made of wet rags and mint leaves, or for the truly desperate, a course of nasal cauterization. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Still, there were breakthroughs. Slowly, inconsistently, but genuinely. Journals began publishing medical case studies. Scientists began experimenting with herbal extracts, and patients, actual living, breathing, sneezing patients, were finally being listened to. That alone was revolutionary. Because for centuries, sneezing had been symbolic, a mystery, a moral failing. Now, it was becoming biological, understandable, predictable, not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily enough that people could begin to imagine a future where you didn't have to choose between powdered wigs and oxygen. This wasn't the grand climax of allergy history, not yet. But it was the overture, the allergic enlightenment, a time when science rubbed its eyes, blew its nose, and started asking better questions. And for those living through it, those caught between old myths and new medicine, it must have been bewildering. One day you're burning incense to ward off spirits. The next you're being told to keep a pollen diary. Change doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives with confusion and, often, more sneezing. But if you were lucky, very lucky, you might just get to walk through a garden without being accused of sorcery. You might even get a doctor who didn't prescribe something that once lived under a log. Still, not everyone embraced science. Not everyone welcomed flowers. And some very rich people, they made things worse. Because in the next chapter we enter the botanical nightmare, where plants become status symbols, and your lungs pay the price. It started, as all disasters do, with rich people and their hobbies. In the late 18th century, botany became fashionable. Not practical farming or medicinal herbs. No, this was ornamental botany. Decorative flora, exotic plants from faraway colonies, housed in glass orangeries, and paraded around drawing rooms, like leafy little trophies. If you were aristocratic and not growing something unpronounceable in a pot, were you even trying to show off? Suddenly, having a personal garden wasn't enough. You needed a collection. Ferns from the Americas, orchids from the East Indies, pollen bombs from every continent, dragged across oceans in the name of aesthetics, and sneezed at by unsuspecting servants for generations. The wealthier you were, the more likely your estate resembled a botanical minefield. Let's tour one of these homes, shall we? You walk into the conservatory. It's warm, humid, and smells faintly of rotting mulch and colonial ambition. Vines creep up the walls. Blossoms hang heavy from branches dripping with nectar and menace. Somewhere nearby, a tropical lily releases its pollen into the air like it's sending a passive-aggressive letter to your lungs. A servant arrives to offer tea. He is wheezing. You are wheezing. The plants are thriving. But you can't just leave. This is high society. The Duchess insists you see her latest acquisition, a rare flowering vine that only blooms once a decade and looks like a cursed cabbage. It releases a cloud of yellow dust as it opens. You try not to inhale. You fail. And here's the thing, no one else reacts. At least, not out loud. Because sneezing in polite company is gauche. It's interpreted as a moral failing, or, worse, a sign of weak breeding. So you sit there, face twitching, eyes watering, as someone recites poetry about the beauty of nature. You want to scream, but that would be common. Botanical obsession didn't stop at flowers. Aristocrats filled their parlors with decorative shrubs, potted citrus trees, and fragrant herbs, all packed into poorly ventilated rooms where firewood smoked in the grates, and everyone wore 3 layers of wool. If you had allergies, these spaces were less elegant drawing rooms and more ornate torture chambers. It was like being waterboarded with lavender. Even literature got in on the action. Poets wrote odes to gardens, to roses, to the sweet perfume of spring, blissfully unaware that those perfumes were slowly murdering their more sensitive readers. One woman famously wrote that her soul blossomed with the lilacs. Historians believe she died shortly after from tuberculosis, or lilacs. It's hard to say, but the real villains of this leafy opera. Greenhouses. Ah yes, the greenhouse. That humid glass box of prestige, where you could store your most fragile, high-maintenance, pollen-spewing specimens. These structures were architectural marvels and respiratory nightmares. Inside, temperatures soared. Moisture clung to everything. Spores grew like ambition at a family inheritance meeting. Owners would proudly invite guests inside, guiding them through aisles of botanical terrors. "This one's from Ceylon," they'd say, brushing the leaves and releasing another invisible puff of sneeze dust into the ether. "It requires constant heat and attention, so do your lungs," but no one seems to care. Let that image settle. You, dressed in full court attire, standing in a cloud of foreign pollen, unable to wipe your nose because the handkerchief is monogrammed and purely decorative. You begin to feel lightheaded. Someone hands you a sprig of rosemary for strength. It does not help. And the worst part, the trend trickled down. Middle-class households, eager to mimic the elite, started bringing plants indoors too. Ferns on mantelpieces, potted ivy in corners, herbs growing in kitchen windows. Homes that had once smelled like soup and wet dogs now smelled like sage, lavender, and slow suffocation. People began to associate plants with refinement, never mind the coughing fits or mysterious rashes that followed. Children growing up in these homes had no escape. One moment they were feeding the cat, the next they were breaking out in hives from the decorative hibiscus in the hallway. Schools followed suit. Classrooms were brightened with floral arrangements, often provided by local dignitaries who thought chrysanthemums were charming instead of mildly toxic. You haven't lived until you've tried to conjugate Latin through an allergy-induced nosebleed. By now, a few medical minds had started to suspect something. They noticed that patients with certain symptoms, sneezing, itchy eyes, shortness of breath, always got worse in spring, or when visiting gardens, or when around, say, 15 types of imported lily. A few brave souls began to record this. Patient reports difficulty breathing after exposure to ornamental foliage. Subject cannot tolerate the conservatory. It was the beginning of pattern recognition, a hint of real science. But society didn't care. Plants were beautiful, exotic, civilized. Suffering in their presence was just part of the package. Like tight shoes or terrible husbands. If you couldn't handle a little sneezing, you clearly weren't built for high society. Drink some tea, dab your face. Stop being dramatic. And what if you tried to avoid it? What if you told your hostess, "Sorry, I can't come to your floral-themed soiree. I break out in pustules when near chrysanthemums." You'd be labeled difficult, unfeminine, possibly unwell in the head. Better to suffer politely. Sneeze discreetly, blame it on the weather. Because admitting that plants were out to get you? That was unthinkable. Even now, it's worth asking. Can plants commit manslaughter? Probably not legally. But historically, absolutely. They infiltrated homes, churches, parlors, and hospitals. They were gifted, traded, and celebrated. And all the while, they choked lungs, swelled throats, and triggered allergic reactions powerful enough to ruin lives. But hey, at least they looked good. Still, there was one season where the truth became harder to ignore. One stretch of time when allergies went from background nuisance to full-blown public misery. Summer. The golden months of beauty and unrelenting, inescapable suffering. Summer in the 1700s. The sun is high. The bees are buzzing. The flowers are blooming with careless abandon. Children run barefoot through fields. Couples picnic beneath shady trees. Everything smells like warm earth, fresh grass, and despair. Because if you had allergies, summer wasn't a season, it was a sentence. There is no greater betrayal than the one inflicted by beauty. You step outside, drawn by the shimmering light and gentle breeze, only to be met with an invisible wall of pollen. Your eyes begin to itch, your throat tight. You feel a sneeze gather deep within your soul like a storm preparing to break. And you haven't even left the porch yet. Let's say you do make it out the door. You've been invited to a picnic, a charming affair in a nearby meadow with music, wine, and social obligations. You arrive dressed in your best, a fresh kerchief tucked in your sleeve. Within minutes the air turns against you. The flowers are shedding, the grasses are shedding, the trees are engaged in some kind of leafy reproductive frenzy, and you're the unwilling bystander caught in the crossfire. Your nose begins to leak. Not drip leak, like a pipe that's lost the will to hold water. You discreetly dab with your handkerchief. The fabric disintegrates. You try again. Still leaking. You excuse yourself to the edge of the gathering and attempt to sneeze with dignity. You fail. Nearby, someone is playing a lute. Children are laughing. Bees are pollinating with violent efficiency, and you are gently wheezing into your wine cup. Eyes streaming like a grieving widow in a romance novel. You want to explain, it's the pollen, it's the air, it's the grass, but no one understands. You're simply delicate, high-strung, possibly allergic to attention. Eventually, you retreat under a tree and pretend to nap, just to spare others the horror of your face, which now resembles a tomato that's been left out in the rain. You're not sleeping, you're trying to breathe through a single functioning nostril while bees hover nearby with hostile curiosity. Let's not forget the bugs. Mosquitoes, wasps, horseflies, all drawn to your sweaty, inflamed misery like tiny winged sadists. You swat at them weakly. One lands on your cheek. You slap yourself. You sneeze. The children watch from a distance, concerned, or amused, or both. The heat doesn't help. Summer clothes, such as they are, offer little relief. Men still wear layers. Women still wear corsets. The human body, encased in wool and linen, begins to cook gently in its own discomfort. And if you dare to remove a layer, or God forbid, perspire visibly, you risk being labelled vulgar, uncivilized, a public menace with a moisture problem. And so, you suffer quietly. At night, the heat lingers. Your bedroom window is closed, of course. Open windows invite spirits, burglars, and plague. The air inside is thick, still, and scented with the day's misery. Your bedsheets are scratchy. Your pillow is warm. You lie there, eyes open, mouth open, sniffling in the dark, counting the seconds between sneezes. Your partner, if you have one, pretends to sleep. Summer allergies weren't just physical torment. They were emotional sabotage. Weddings, festivals, public dances, all designed for summer's peak, all filled with flowers, garlands, and outdoor socializing. If your sinuses revolted, you were marked. A party pooper, a recluse, that person who never looks quite well, the cruelty of beauty that hurts you. There's something uniquely devastating about being repelled by what others admire. To watch people bask in golden light while your body sounds the histamine alarm. To see couples embrace beneath blooming trees while you try to locate the nearest water source to rinse out your eyeballs. To attend a garden party knowing full well you are the only one who will leave with a rash shaped like a fern. Some tried to cope. They invented folk methods. Breathing through a damp cloth, holding mint under the tongue, drinking strange teas made from boiled bark and wishful thinking. A few even attempted avoidance, scheduling trips to the seaside, not for fun, but for escape. Sea air, they believed, was clean, pollen-free, pure. It wasn't, but it felt like a plan. And for the rich, summer meant retreating to estates in higher altitudes, where cooler temperatures and sparser vegetation offered some relief. They didn't know why they felt better. They just did. And they attributed it to climate, or constitutional recovery, or being away from the city's bad air. Not the grass. Never the grass. Still, for most people, there was no relief. There were no vacations. You endured, because what else could you do? You sat at the market stall, sniffling between transactions. You walked to church, eyes watering as the wildflowers nodded beside the path. You harvested your crops while trying not to asphyxiate in your own sweat and nasal runoff. You didn't complain. Because sneezing wasn't serious, you weren't dying. You were just uncomfortable. deeply, endlessly uncomfortable. And even now, we underestimate it. We romanticize the past, the candlelit dinners, the horse-drawn carriages, the pastoral beauty. But we forget that the person in the carriage might have been silently enduring a 6-hour sneezing fit, while dressed like a velvet chandelier, that the man in the oil painting may have been mid-pollen attack, that the elegant lady by the roses was actually in respiratory distress. So here's to the summer sufferers of the past. To the ones who went to festivals with pockets full of herbs and hope, who danced with red eyes, who smiled through swelling, who endured bee stings, hay bales, sun rash, and the emotional violence of outdoor weddings. They were heroes. Mostly congested heroes. But next we head indoors again to places of silence, sanctity, and sacred suffering, because when incense meets allergies, faith meets phlegm. Welcome to Sneezing Through Religion. It's Sunday morning in 1749. You've woken up with the usual nasal situation, one nostril fully clogged, the other hanging on by sheer spite. Your throat is raw, your head is full of cotton. But that doesn't matter. You're going to church, because even if your sinuses are staging an insurrection, skipping mass is a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. You put on your finest, which, naturally, is wool. Heavy, itchy, dust-collecting wool. Your boots are stiff, your collar scratches. You tuck a handkerchief in your sleeve, a grim little flag of surrender, and trudge towards salvation with a prayer in your heart and mucus in your mustache. The church is cold and damp, because of course it is. Mold climbs the stone walls like ivy. The pews smell like wet pine and centuries of human breath. But the real villain hasn't arrived yet. Not until the priest begins to swing the censer, the gleaming, beautiful chain-suspended globe of holy smoke that makes the entire congregation smell like a burning apothecary. Incense, frankincense, myrrh, resins ground to powder and ignited in the name of purification. The sacred aroma of sanctity, also your immune system's worst enemy. The first breath burns. The second triggers a throat tickle. By the third you're full-on coughing, but you can't cough. This is church. Coughing during the liturgy is rude, suspicious, possibly heretical. So you try to contain it. You swallow hard. You breathe shallow. You dab your eyes as if moved by the sermon. You are not moved. You are actively being suffocated by sacred smoke. A boy next to you sneezes. Loudly. Heads turn. His mother hisses. The priest glances up, mid-blessing, incense drifting around him like divine fog. Somewhere in the rafters, pigeons rustle. This is not a safe space for the congested. Now, incense wasn't just a pleasant aroma. It was believed to purify the soul, cleanse the air of demons, and lift prayers to heaven. It was everywhere. Funerals, weddings, feast days, penance rituals. Some churches used it sparingly, others, not so much. One particularly pious parish in Spain was known for filling the nave with so much incense that people reportedly passed out from holy fervor. It was probably hypoxia, but poetic nonetheless. If you were sensitive to smoke, church became a minefield. You wanted to be devout. You wanted to worship. But halfway through the service, your eyes were red, your lungs were closing and your prayers sounded like wheezing. You tried to mask it, blamed emotion, or the spirit, or fasting weakness. But the truth was simpler. You were allergic to God's air freshener. But it wasn't just incense. Let's talk about relics. Holy relics. Bones, cloth, splinters of sacred wood were often housed in elaborate containers, surrounded by flowers, candles, and dust-covered velvet. Pilgrims would line up to kiss these items, press their foreheads against them, and breathe deeply in their presence. Imagine doing that with hay fever, or a mold allergy. You're kneeling before a 300-year-old femur in a display case that hasn't been opened since the Reformation. You inhale, you black out. Blessed be. Then there were the processions. During major feast days, entire towns would march through the streets bearing statues, crosses, and incense burners the size of watermelons. Flower petals rained down, candles smoked, choirs sang, and if you were part of the devout crowd, especially if you were close to the action, your reward was a sinus full of spiritual debris. And no one excused themselves. You marched. You sniffled. You suffered. Monasteries had their own special brand of allergenic serenity. Monks rose early, prayed in candlelit chapels, and lived surrounded by parchment, wool, dried herbs, and beeswax. It was peaceful. It was quiet. It was basically a controlled allergy experiment. If the incense didn't get you, the moldy manuscripts would. One monk reportedly sneezed so violently during morning prayer that he knocked over a candle and set part of the altar cloth alight. His brothers considered it a test of faith. He considered it Tuesday. And don't even start on fasting. When fasting, your immune system is already stressed. You're lightheaded, dehydrated, and now sitting in a room full of burning spices while someone chants in Latin. Your body wants to collapse, but you hold steady, clutching your prayer book, leaking quietly onto the pages. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the tissues. Modern comparison? It's like having a nut allergy at a peanut butter convention. You know you shouldn't be there. You know it's going to end badly, but everyone else is smiling, and the architecture is nice, and you're not about to tell your mother you skipped church because the building makes your throat close. Some parishioners tried to cope creatively. They tied cloth around their faces. They sat near the door. One clever woman reportedly filled her bonnet with dried mint and breathed through the brim during services. She was accused of vanity. Another man wore gloves dipped in vinegar and kept them near his nose until the bishop told him to stop showing off his afflictions. Because suffering was supposed to be silent, stoic, holy. Still, the church wasn't totally blind. Some priests noticed recurring complaints. People fainting mid-mass, children vomiting during holy days, entire choirs croaking through canticles, but instead of blaming allergens, they blamed sin, or spirits, or simply weak constitutions. If you had trouble in the presence of incense, maybe you needed more prayer, or more discipline, or more water blessed under the right star. And so the cycle continued. Devotion mixed with discomfort. Faith tangled with fatigue. People showed up, Sunday after Sunday, eyes red, noses raw, hands folded, because this was more than ritual. This was endurance. This was worship in the face of histamines. And as the final hymn rang out, and the bells tolled, and the incense curled into the rafters like holy smoke signals, the faithful emerged into the sunlight, blinking, coughing, dabbing at their noses with reverence. And behind them, the sanctuary emptied, the relics settled, the flowers drooped, the incense drifted. But in the palaces and courts of kings, the sneezing had just begun, because even royalty wasn't immune, and some of them had reputations to protect. Picture this. Versailles, 1774. The halls shimmer with chandeliers. The perfume is thick enough to be weaponized. Courtiers in brocade and powder float across the marble like decorative ghosts, and somewhere in the midst of this royal pageantry, the king sneezes, violently. Not just a dainty achoo, we're talking a catastrophic royal nose eruption that echoes through the corridor and sends powdered wigs shuddering. One sneeze, and the mood shifts. Did someone offend His Majesty's humours? Did the wine turn? Is it the Austrian again? Because when royalty sniffled, people noticed. Unlike peasants who were allowed to ooze and sneeze in peace, or in the fields, the nobility had to do it with style. Sneezing in public wasn't just a bodily function, it was a performance, a power play, a minor scandal, and allergies. They weren't considered real, they were delicate constitutions, vapours, or an imbalance of the soul's phlegm, which frankly sounds worse. Take Louis XVI, for instance. Poor guy couldn't catch a break. Between the political collapse of France and the collapse of his own immune system, he had issues. Some rumours suggest the king suffered from seasonal hay fever, although back then it didn't have a name. He was just mysteriously puffy in spring. His eyes watered during royal processions, his nose turned a seditious shade of red during official dinners, and the court physicians, bless them, blamed everything except nature. Too much pheasant? Not enough sex? Unstable stars? Quick, prescribe a mustard footbath and 4 boiled leeches. His queen, Marie Antoinette, was no better off. She was reportedly sensitive to fragrances, which in the Palace of Perfume Death was akin to being allergic to breathing. Court ladies soaked themselves in everything from rose oil to ambergris, aka whale vomit, and the queen, with her dainty sensibilities and public expectations, had to suffer through scented ambush after scented ambush. There's a nice chance She developed headaches from this nasal assault. Unfortunately, Advil wouldn't be invented for another 80 years. Meanwhile, over in England, the nobility wasn't faring much better. King George III was famously unwell, and while most of that centered around his mental health, there were reports of unexplained skin conditions, congestion, and melancholy induced by garden air. Sound familiar? It should. That's the 18th century way of saying, I sneezed in a hedge maze, and now I want to die. Still, admitting to allergies in royal circles was like admitting you had debts, or emotions, or a rash. It simply wasn't done. A nobleman didn't sniffle, he withdrew to reflect. A duchess didn't wheeze, she retired to compose herself. The language of suffering was so euphemistic it might as well have been interpretive dance. Now let's talk about court physicians, whose job it was to maintain royal health while also not getting beheaded. If the king was sneezing, it couldn't be pollen. That would suggest that the king, God's appointed ruler, was subject to the whims of flowers. Unacceptable. So they reached for explanations that were vague enough to sound clever and specific enough to sound authoritative. Your Majesty's humours are disturbed by excessive lunar dampness. Madam's nose weeps with the weight of ancestral grief. This congestion is political in nature. The cures were equally absurd. Royal allergy sufferers might be dosed with camphor, bled at the temples, or locked in cedar-lined rooms to rebalance their moistures. In one German duchy, a physician prescribed crushed emeralds, mixed with goat's milk for a countess who sneezed during Easter. Did it help? Absolutely not. But it was expensive, and that counted for something. What made allergies so dangerous in these circles wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the social fallout. A king with sniffles looked weak. A queen who sneezed mid-entrance ruined the choreography. Etiquette manuals of the time even warned against unseemly facial disruptions, which is a poetic way of saying, don't have a pollen attack at the masquerade. To cope, royals employed handkerchief strategies, not just any cloth monogrammed, perfumed, and handled with courtly flair. There was an entire etiquette to sneezing. If you must sneeze, do it once, never twice. Do it quietly, unless you're the king, then it's a divine trumpet. And for the love of God, don't sneeze on the French ambassador. But behind the silks and scented fans, real people suffered. They endured it with clenched jaws and tight corsets, dabbing at their noses with trembling grace. Some disappeared from court altogether during allergy season. They went on retreats, which usually meant locking themselves in well-aired rooms and praying to whatever deity covered respiratory health. And yet, despite all the sneezing, all the itching, and all the mysterious rashes, nobody dared utter the word allergy. That word wouldn't exist until the 20th century. Until then, everyone was just sensitive, constitutionally fragile, or in a bizarre twist, fashionably afflicted. Yes, you heard that right. Among certain noble circles, being visibly affected by the seasons was considered chic. It meant you were refined, attuned, so delicate you could practically communicate with flowers, like a human teacup. A nosebleed in spring, Tresiligon, fainting during a rose-scented ball, iconic. But this trend only lasted as long as it stayed poetic. The moment someone erupted into a 3-minute fit of uncontrollable snot explosions, the fantasy collapsed. And so, royal allergy sufferers were caught in the same trap as everyone else. Mocked if they suffered, ignored if they didn't, they just had better curtains to cry into. As for the commoners, they didn't have physicians, or perfumed hankies, or cedar rooms. They had straw beds, mouldy bread, and open windows that let in every speck of airborne misery. And yet, perhaps, they could sneeze freely, loudly, righteously. Which brings us to our next chapter. Because if you think allergies and revolution don't mix, just wait until history starts coughing. Let's set the stage. France. 1789. The air is thick with rebellion and pollen. Bread is scarce. Tensions are high. And as the people sharpen their pitchforks and metaphors, a quiet, nasal suffering lingers beneath the guillotine's shadow. Because yes, even amidst revolution, allergies found a way to make things worse. Picture Jacques, a modest printer's apprentice in Paris. He's read every pamphlet, cheered every protest, and accidentally inhaled every dust particle in a 10-mile radius. His nose is a red, flaking flag of misery. His eyes are swollen like grapes, but he marches anyway, sneezing out slogans, wheezing in liberty, because nothing says power to the people like chew. Now, We're not suggesting the French Revolution was caused by allergies, but if you've ever tried to hold a rational conversation while congested, you'll know that liberty, fraternity, and sinus clarity do not always go hand in hand. Let that sink in. Even your nose wanted liberty. You see, the late 1700s were a time of radical ideas, reason, rights, reforms. But when it came to health, superstitions still clung like cobwebs in a crypt. People believed in miasmas, humours, planetary misalignment, but Enlightenment thinkers were poking holes in those traditions, just like they were poking holes in the monarchy. And in those holes, dust, spores, airborne misery. As political philosophies soared, so did the pollen count. Paris was expanding, paving over fields, stirring up centuries of sediment, while noble estates left abandoned or looted, shed their linens, releasing decades of trapped allergens into the rebellious wind. Revolutionary meetings were often held in dusty salons, echoing churches, or outdoor cafes surrounded by flowering trees. These were not hypoallergenic safe zones, these were histamine thunderdomes. Men debated Rousseau while discreetly wiping their noses on lace cuffs. Women penned political poems while coughing into sleeves embroidered with liberty's tears, or possibly mold spores. Even the great thinkers weren't immune. Jean-Paul Marat, revolutionary journalist and proud owner of a perpetually inflamed skin condition, likely had sensitivities that today we'd classify as allergic reactions. His bath-bound lifestyle wasn't just for relaxation. It was the only way he could function without erupting in angry hives. In modern terms, the man was one scented candle away from disaster. And then there was Robespierre, the incorruptible. The man with a voice like sandpaper and a stare that could curdle milk. He also had chronic respiratory issues. Was it asthma? Was it seasonal allergies? Was it the weight of ideological purity pressing on his sinuses? Hard to say. But reports of his dry, rasping coughs during speeches suggest he might have been battling more than political opposition. Now imagine being in a revolutionary crowd, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of citizens. The smell of unwashed wigs, the press of sweaty bodies. Someone hands you a tropicolor rosette, and you accept it only to realize it's been stored in a hay-lined box. Your eyes start to twitch, your throat tightens, but you're here for justice. So you stay. Suffering becomes patriotic. And it's not just France. Across the Atlantic, during America's own Enlightenment-flavored tantrum, Benjamin Franklin famously wrote about sneezing powder, used in pranks, but also as a way to relieve nasal blockage. Franklin, who spent a fair amount of time in musty libraries and Parisian drawing rooms, likely suffered from seasonal afflictions himself. Did he invent bifocals because pollen blurred his vision? Probably not. But the sneezing fits? Entirely plausible. Back in Europe, revolutionary doctors began to take a more clinical look at the human body. Not as a vessel for sin, but as a machine. A flawed, leaky, sputtering machine. And sneezing? That was the engine backfiring. These medical thinkers began collecting case studies, recording symptoms, naming things. One of those names? Hay fever. Though the term wouldn't catch on until later, early documentation began during this era. British physician John Bostock, who would eventually give hay fever its first formal description in 1819, was part of this new wave of logical thinking, but the groundwork was laid in the 1700s, when rebellion wasn't just political, but medical. Because to say, my sneezing is not a curse, it is a condition, was a small revolution in itself. People began whispering the truth behind the coughs. Maybe the baker's son wasn't weak, maybe he was allergic to flour. Maybe the Duchess wasn't overcome with spiritual torment. Maybe she just shouldn't stand near Jasmine. And maybe, just maybe, all this talk of liberty and human dignity could extend to the sniffly, the red-eyed, and the perpetually congested. But freedom isn't linear, and neither is science. While some embraced this new clarity, others clung to older beliefs. One revolutionary mob reportedly blamed a priest's hay cart for cursed air and pelted it with stones. Another group insisted that sneezing during debate meant divine approval, so progress was patchy. Still, change was coming. The guillotines may have stolen the spotlight, but in quieter corners, the Enlightenment was doing something radical, acknowledging reality, that symptoms were symptoms, that sneezing wasn't moral failure, that a red nose didn't make you less human, just more prone to suffering. Which, come to think of it, was the entire revolutionary thesis. So next time you reach for a tissue during allergy season, imagine a Parisian rebel doing the same, with a sleeve, a grimace, and a pocket full of pamphlets. Picture a powdered nobleman choking on pollen as the Bastille crumbles. Think of the revolution not just as a political upheaval, but as the slow, wheezing birth of understanding. Because when you can finally breathe freely, that's its own kind of liberty. And if you thought revolutionary medicine was questionable, wait until you meet the folks who tried to cure allergies with roasted hedgehogs. If science was having a cautious glow-up during the Enlightenment, folk medicine was doubling down on chaos. Because for every powdered wig doctor scribbling notes on nasal inflammation, there were 15 street peddlers yelling, "Soothe your skull with boiled turnip," while waving bags of mysterious powders that smelled like armpits and regret. Enter the allergy sufferer with no money, no education, and no access to powdered court physicians. Your average 1700s sneezer didn't have a personal herbalist or a cedar-lined antechamber. They had damp alleyways, mysterious stalls, and whatever home-brewed advice their aunt's cousin's goat could bleat out. Welcome to the bizarre, sometimes terrifying world of folk allergy cures. Let's meet our tragic protagonist, Elias, a 22-year-old cobbler's apprentice in London. Elias has a nose that leaks like a faulty beer cask and eyes red enough to frighten livestock. He's tried everything, pinching his nose while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards, sniffing flour mixed with lavender, and sleeping with a potato under his pillow. Nothing worked. So, on a fog-choked morning in Spitalfields Market, he turns to a back-alley vendor known only as Warty Nancy. Warty Nancy sells wind medicine, which sounds like something you'd use for a broken sail but is in fact a satchel of crushed beetles, garlic skin and something suspiciously mossy. She insists it must be worn around the neck for 3 consecutive lunar cycles, while avoiding all dairy and direct eye contact with chimney sweeps. Elias, desperate and congested, pays 2 pence and starts sneezing harder. Still, Nancy's concoctions weren't even the strangest options. In rural areas, you might be prescribed a toadstone, a magical fossil once believed to suck poison from the body. Some people carried dried hedgehog skin in their waistcoats to ward off coughing. Others believed that roasting a live newt and inhaling the smoke would calm the lungs. Let that one settle in your nostrils for a moment. And then there was garlic. Garlic was the Swiss Army knife of peasant medicine. Have a rash? Rub garlic. Coughing? Eat garlic. Sneezing uncontrollably every time a cloud sneezes in your general direction? Hang roasted garlic above your door, wear it in your shoes, and bathe in it every new moon. Did it help? Not even a little. But you'd smell so revolting that even allergens kept their distance. Elias tries this too. He buys a linen pouch filled with garlic bulbs and sleeps with it around his neck like a saint's relic. He wakes up soaked in garlic sweat, the rats have moved out, and his landlord thinks he's conjuring spirits. His sinuses, however, remain tragically unbothered. Other folk remedies included snorting vinegar, stuffing bread crusts in your ears, don't ask, rubbing raw onion on your temples, or eating a paste of ash and honey to dry the humours. And if you were lucky, a local cunning woman might burn herbs under your bed and chant prayers to banish lung demons. Did any of this work? Absolutely not, but it gave people something to do between sneezes. Meanwhile, desperate city dwellers like Elias might turn to travelling physic men, wandering salesmen with carts full of cure-alls. These quacks promised relief from every affliction: boils, melancholy, marital disobedience, and of course, spring trembling of the face. That's how they described allergies. With flair. One particularly popular product, Dr. Wensley's throat elixir, which contained equal parts honey, turpentine and brandy. You'd gargle it, pass out for 20 minutes, and wake up slightly drunk and still sneezing. At least you couldn't feel your face. There was also powdered toadstool, advertised as mushroom dust for moral fortitude, and known to cause hallucinations. And if you were really desperate, someone might offer a snuff made from dried wasp nests. Which, yes, is exactly as terrible as it sounds. Elias finally ends up in a shadowy corner of London's medical underbelly, a basement where a man in a powdered wig and no pants burns sulphur while reciting Latin. The treatment? Inhale garlic smoke through a funnel while holding your breath and thinking of pleasing cows. After 15 minutes, Elias coughs so violently he loses a molar and swears off all dairy for life. But here's the thing, even though the cures were nonsense, the desperation was very real. Imagine living with constant sinus pressure, itchy eyes, and coughing fits in a society that doesn't believe allergies exist. Your suffering isn't named, it isn't seen, you're just sensitive, weak, in need of spiritual correction or a brisk walk in the woods. Never mind that the woods are the problem, so you try anything, everything, even if it means rubbing badger fat on your chest while someone sings at your feet, because you just want to breathe. That's what makes this chapter more than a joke. It's a window into the quiet agony of untreated, misunderstood illness, how it drives people into the arms of charlatans and folklore, because the alternative is doing nothing, because sneezing isn't fatal, but it's relentless, exhausting, and sometimes hopelessness wears the face of a rat-bitten man selling powdered moths. Elias never finds a cure, his sinuses never clear. But he does eventually discover that rinsing his face in cold water and moving away from mouldy bedding helps a little. Not revolutionary, not magical, just slightly better. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival isn't about dramatic cures. It's about tiny adjustments. Learning which corner of your room doesn't make you wheeze, which blanket doesn't itch, which alley isn't selling powdered disaster. It's also about knowing when not to inhale burning garlic through a brass funnel. But Elias wouldn't be the last to try. The world was changing. Slowly, quietly, just like science. And somewhere out there, a new idea was forming. What if, instead of roasted frogs, we tried hygiene? Speaking of which, the invention of the handkerchief is next. And yes, it's grosser than you think. Let's take a moment to appreciate a humble, unsung hero, the handkerchief. That dainty square of cloth, now mostly relegated to grandpas and dramatic Victorian novels, was once a medical breakthrough, a fabric revolution, the 18th century equivalent of inventing the iPhone. If the iPhone's main function was politely catching mucus, before the handkerchief went mainstream, people sneezed into whatever they could find, sleeves, aprons, dogs, or the air itself. And since germ theory wouldn't make its fashionable entrance until the 1800s, no one saw the issue. Snot was simply expelled into the world, with dignity or not. But then came refinement. The Enlightenment, bless its sneezy soul, began introducing ideas like hygiene, manners, and please stop launching bodily fluids into my breakfast. This shift wasn't instant. It was more of a slow burn, or a slow drip, depending on your sinuses. And to the handkerchief, a symbol of cleanliness, etiquette, and eventually, aggressive class signaling. Early handkerchiefs weren't made for illness. They were tokens, accessories, tools for fluttering during romantic encounters, or dabbing away a single poetic tear. They were embroidered, perfumed, and gently waved at crushes across candlelit rooms. If you used one to actually blow your nose, society clutched its pearls. That's what your sleeve was for. But the tides turned, slowly, as upper classes began prioritizing cleanliness. Mostly out of fear of smelling like the lower ones, sneezing etiquette evolved. Blowing your nose into a fine square of lace became acceptable. Not sexy, exactly, but respectable. As if to say, yes, I expel fluids, but I do it in 400 thread count Belgian linen. Soon, the handkerchief was everywhere, especially in cities where the air quality hovered somewhere between cold-choked death and light-lung sandblasting. London was a perpetual cloud of soot, dung, and decaying humanity. Paris wasn't much better. If you walked outside without a cloth to cover your face, you'd come home with a nose full of industrial regret and the cough of a Dickens character. Handkerchiefs became survival tools and social cues. Carrying one said you were refined, clean, maybe even health-conscious. Not that anyone knew why it mattered, but they sensed it. Subconsciously, the world was waking up to the fact that maybe your bodily excretions should stay attached to your person. And then came the snuff box. Ah yes, powdered tobacco. Because nothing says I can barely breathe like voluntarily snorting dust. Snuff was all the rage among the fashionable elite. You'd tap a tiny silver box, sniff the contents, and then, with great pride, sneeze dramatically into your monogrammed kerchief. It was performative allergy, voluntary histamine theatre. Some people even dyed their handkerchiefs dark so the tobacco stains wouldn't show. That's right, people literally color-coordinated their mucus. If you're feeling fancy today, Remember, someone once embroidered golden thread onto the corner of a cloth they used to blow their nose. Prestige has always had a weird sense of humor. Meanwhile, in the street-level trenches, poor folks made do with whatever scraps they could find. Old cloth, rags, or just the back of their hand. And while the rich flaunted their sniffles with decorative elegance, the lower classes were forced to manage with sleeves, elbows, or just the hope that no one was looking. But as the handkerchief trickled down through society like most things do eventually, attitudes shifted. It became less about style and more about survival. Doctors started advising the use of cloths to cover sneezes, especially during outbreaks. Not because they understood contagion, they still blamed everything on bad air, but because it seemed to help. And if something seems to help in an era without antibiotics, you go with it. The rise of personal cleanliness also contributed. Soap became more available. Public bathhouses gained popularity. People started noticing that when they washed their hands, their eyes stopped itching quite so much. Could this be related? Maybe. Not that they made the leap to allergens yet. That would require science microscopes and a few thousand more sneezes. But the connection between cleanliness and less suffering was starting to peek through the pollen-covered haze. Let's not forget this was also the golden age of manners. Politeness manuals exploded in popularity. Books like The Gentleman's Guide to Graceful Living, or a treatise on civil behavior, told you exactly what to do with your bodily fluids. Hint, don't flick them. Sneezing without a kerchief became a faux pas, an offence only slightly less scandalous than being poor or visibly sweaty. One guide from 1764 advised, "Should one be gripped by nasal expulsion, let thy handkerchief be at the ready, and retire to a corner if dignity allows." Translation, blow your nose, but please, not near the canapés. This culture of containment didn't just reflect hygiene, it shaped it. People began designing coats with inner pockets just for handkerchiefs. Schools taught children to always carry one. Ladies embroidered them with initials, lace, or tiny cats, presumably for strength. Soldiers carried kerchiefs as part of their field kits. Even criminals were said to blow their noses before going to the gallows, dignity and death, and all that. Which brings us to the awkward transition point. Just as society was getting used to handkerchiefs, along came the industrial age, and eventually the disposable tissue, but that's another chapter. For now, the 1700s remained firmly in team fabric, and while cloth kerchiefs weren't sanitary by modern standards, they were, let's be honest, reusable biohazards. They were a step forward. A soggy, embroidered, mildly perfumed step forward. Because for the first time in history, people weren't just sneezing into the wind. They were managing it, owning it, folding it into quarters, and tucking it discreetly into silk-lined pockets. And that's how a piece of cloth became the front line in the battle against allergies. Not a cure, but a companion. A loyal square soldier against the eternal war of the sinuses. So yes, your grandma's handkerchief drawer, it has a legacy. And speaking of legacies, our final chapter takes us into the present, where allergy shots exist, tissues come in soothing pastel boxes, and at long last, sneezing isn't a sin. And here we are, the finish line. The final sniffle, after 17 chapters of sneezing through soot, superstition, and salt-cured frog skins, we finally made it to the present day, where your tissues come in lavender-scented boxes, and your antihistamines don't double as rat poison. Progress, baby. Today, the sneeze has lost its scandal. It's routine, slightly embarrassing, socially awkward, sure, especially during flu season, when one innocent chew in an elevator clears the place faster than a fire drill. But still, we live in a world where your average allergic episode doesn't land you on trial for witchcraft. That's a win. And yet, there's something tender about the old suffering. Not nostalgic. We're not yearning for powdered lice wigs and badger fat balms. But there's a soft sadness in knowing how long it took to be taken seriously. How many people spent lifetimes wiping their noses on shame, praying for relief that never came. Let's pause and honor that. Not with candles or Gregorian chants, that would just trigger someone's incense sensitivity. But with quiet recognition. Because behind every historical absurdity in this story, there were real people, real discomfort, real tears. Some from emotion, some from chronic eye irritation. It's easy to laugh at leeches, vinegar nostrums, and sneeze-triggered exorcisms. It's harder to sit with the human truth underneath. People were suffering, they didn't know why, and they were trying, desperately, sometimes dangerously, to stop the invisible misery. Allergies don't look tragic on the surface. They're not cinematic. You don't win medals for surviving hay fever. You just endure, with tissues in one pocket and hope in the other. And in that quiet, enduring misery, there's a certain dignity. Today's allergy sufferer has a full toolkit: antihistamines, nasal sprays, air purifiers, even allergy shots. And sure, modern life brings its own pollen-covered horrors. Climate change means longer allergy seasons, urban pollution adds insult to histamine injury, and mold still lurks in every college dorm carpet. But you're not rubbing garlic on your forehead. You're not consulting your star chart to decide when to sneeze. You're not hiding from society because your nose weeps like a Victorian widow. You're seen, diagnosed, managed. You have soft, disposable tissues. You can carry a bottle of allergy meds so tiny it fits in your coin pocket. You can go to the pharmacy and buy relief. No boiling frogs required. Is that not a kind of miracle? Think back to Jacob the hay-fevered peasant, who coughed his way through fields he couldn't afford to flee, or Elias the cobbler's apprentice, inhaling garlic smoke in a candlelit basement, just to feel something besides desperation. These people never got better, they just sneezed through life until it stopped. And yet, they are part of your story. The itchy-eyed ghosts of history linger in every nasal spray aisle, watching you read ingredient labels and whispering, "We walk through pollen barefoot so you could have Claritin." Probably. Spiritually, at least. So what now? Maybe the modern sneeze is a moment to reflect, to connect, not just to your sinuses, but to the centuries of snot-covered resilience behind you. Every time you unfold a tissue, you're part of a legacy, a soft, absorbent thread that stretches from medieval superstition to microbiology, from demon sneezes to data-driven diagnosis, from powdered newt to purified antihistamines, from salted pork compresses to steroid nasal sprays that smell like artificial eucalyptus. It's ridiculous. And also beautiful. Because the story of allergies isn't just about mucus and pollen. It's about human stubbornness. Our refusal to settle for this is just how it is. Our willingness to try again and again, no matter how absurd the method. That's the heart of it. Hope, desperation, and the occasional toasted hedgehog. And maybe, just maybe, next time someone sneezes next to you on the subway, instead of giving them the death glare of contagious suspicion, you'll think, wow, history, right there, in a nasal explosion. Of course, you can still hand them a tissue. We've come far. Not perfectly, but hilariously. And with that, dear sneezer, we come to the end. Breathe that in, hopefully not dust. If your nose survived this sneeze-filled journey through history, consider rewarding it, and us with a like, subscribe, or a soothing comment. Because allergies are eternal, but so is sarcastic bedtime history. Bless you, and bless the subscribe button while you're at it.